This is Najma Minhas, editor Global Village Space. Today we want to look at the recent moves by China on the line of actual control with India to see what's behind this. Is it to deter India from building roads and infrastructure towards the Karakoram Pass because it threatens China's investment in CPEC? Or is it China's warning shot towards India about the growing relationship it has with the United States in the Indo-Pacific region? Or maybe Beijing is just trying to deflect from its current problems over the corona pandemic. To look at these issues, I have with me Dr. Moeed Pirzada, who's a strategic analyst. Do subscribe to our channel and press the bell as well for notifications. Moeed, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Najma.
Moeed, what's behind China's moves on this line of actual control with India? Why now?
To understand China's broader goals, one has to look at the history from 1962 onwards. Ever since India came into existence in 1947 as a state, and then China in 1948, 49, China and India have a border dispute, which led to a serious war in 1962. They have a shared border of almost 2,100 to 2,200 miles long. And all along, that's a disputed border. And my understanding is this is almost something like 100,000 square miles of disputed territory, which both sides resolved to negotiate and resolve by negotiation. And in 1962, India did the miscalculation when Chinese were posturing, and Pandit Nehru asked the Indian military to throw the PLA out, and that led to a disastrous defeat and humiliation, which is remembered in Indian military history as Himalayan disaster. Or the Himalayan blunder. So the present confrontation, the standoff, is also more or less in the same area in the Ladakh region, which is not very far from the Karakoram Pass. This is not the Karakoram Highway. This is not the KKH. Quite contrary to the understanding in Pakistan, it's not very close to CPEC. This is actually close to the old Karakoram Pass. So, but Indian sides actually feels that whereas the Chinese are actually asserting that it is due to India making border roads and airstrips and because of the infrastructure development. But Indian analysts, and who are very forthright in discussing this, unlike the Chinese who speak very little on this issue, Indians think that it's a broader issue. And China has got this opportunity with much afterthought. And they're trying to press hard and assert India to change its overall posture in the world vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis United States.
Why now, though? I mean, what's special about this time? Because India must have been building the road for quite some time.
There is an immediate, I think it's important to remember what happened between China and India in 2017. And we can also start from 2012 and 2014 in the sense that in 2012, when the current Chinese president, Xi Jinping, took over, he has been perceived as a very strong and decisive Chinese leader, who is now being perceived as he will probably stay on for life as the head of the Chinese Communist regime. He's the one who brought up in 2014 the whole idea of the new Silk Roads, of which CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, is a part. And in 2014, when BJP took over and Narendra Modi became the prime minister, India also got a leader which is very assertive and very aggressive with its neighbors. If you look at the tensions on the line of control in Kashmir between India and Pakistan have never ceased for one single week since 2014, since June 2014. Yep. The firing has never stopped, the shelling has never stopped. And in this time period, India has twice done the so-called surgical strike, one almost literally a so-called a dramatic thing in 2016, which wasn't actually a surgical strike. But in February, 26 February 2019, an actual surgical strike in the Pakistan proper territory, not in the Azad Kashmir areas. Then the 5th August unilateral cancellation, abrogation of the Article 370, the historic arrangement, and also 35A. Also in 2015, the total trade blockade of Nepal. And then with all this background, when you look at, then you come to June 2017, when Chinese were taken by surprise when they were actually making one or two small roads in the Doklam region, which was not disputed with India at all, on which they had a claim with Bhutan. And Bhutan, being the Indian ally, alerted India, and the Indian forces, about less than 300, along with some bulldozers reached there and the Chinese army engineers from construction. And that led to a very serious standoff between China and India that was subsequently resolved. And if you look at the Indian side, Indians basically say that, the both sides withdrew. To that extent, it's true. But Chinese never seriously, to my understanding, is Chinese did not stop the road construction in the Doklam region, and Bhutan actually accepted that territory, the China will continue to make roads in that territory.
And I think built all where the military installation.
Just let me add one single sentence. Sure. I suspect that the Chinese never really have not really accepted. Chinese have aggrieved the way the Indian regime, the Narendra Modi regime, reacted towards Chinese road construction in the Bhutan China area. So right now, this is different. This is different in the sense that previously it used to be few hundred soldiers, like 300 Indian soldiers were involved and few hundred Chinese soldiers were involved in 2017. But now you see thousands of Chinese soldiers, according to some sources, almost 30 kilometers inside the disputed territory on the Indian side, and they are fortifying themselves. They're entrenching themselves. They're bringing weapons and everything.
Do you think Do you think that this is due to two strong men at the helm of two big countries? So in this context, if we look at Rajnath Singh's, the Indian Defense Minister's statement that this is not the India of 1962, do you think he's right? This is not the India of 1962, or is that a show of bravado that he's doing for his own hyper-nationalistic media?
It's both, actually. I mean, it's definitely a show of bravado. They're trying to be very courageous. But it's also true that in the global perception, India has risen a lot in terms of its economy, in terms of its GDP, in terms of its political influence, in terms of its relationship with the West, the strategic alliance with the United States and everything. But there has been a very interesting piece written by two very eminent American scholars of Indian origin, Professor Dr. Moeed Ganguly and Dr. Pardesi, that appeared a few days ago in Foreign Policy, a very prestigious American international relations magazine. And Dr. Ganguly and Pardesi argue that when in 1988, Rajiv Gandhi and Deng Xiaoping met and created a border settlement, a border monitoring mechanism, border agreement mechanism between India and China. India and China are more or less equal in terms of economy and influence. I mean, if the Indian economy was 297 billion GDP, then China was 312 billion GDP. And if the Indian defense budget was close to $10 billion, then Chinese defense budget was close to $11 billion. But since then, if India has now turned itself into a 2.97 or $3 trillion economy, then China is now almost close to a $14 trillion economy. If today India's defense budget is $71 billion, the Chinese defense budget is almost like more than $260 billion. So China's overall leverage in the world has increased. And the question, why this moment, China is now asserting everywhere. It looks as if China is pretty upset the way United States and its allies, the Senate, the Congress, and some of the European allies and agencies accused China for the so-called Wuhan virus, for the COVID-19 spread. And for the past few weeks, China is asserting in South China Sea, where they have sunk a Vietnamese naval vessel. Mm-hmm. They have boarded a Malaysian oil rig. They have been asserting themselves on Taiwan. They have taken a very strong position in Hong Kong by applying the Chinese law onto the Hong Kong. And they have called all United States basically as a political virus thing. And one can actually see that the Chinese leadership is asserting at a moment when American leadership is sort of receding. And what is happening now in the United States actually should be very worrying for all US allies, in the sense that the United States seems to be losing its moral authority and leadership for what's happening for the past 6 days inside the United States. The United States is in no position to tell anyone at this moment anything.
What I find interesting about this, it reminds me of late 19th century, when we saw Germany rising as an industrial power, and it wanted to take its rightful place in the committees of nations, as they say, and which ultimately led to the First World War. Do you see anything along those lines happening with China trying to take its rightful place in the world? I mean, how do we find a resolution?
China definitely wants its rightful place. I mean, before the rise of the British Empire and the creation of the British India of the 18th and 19th century colonial era, till 18th century, there were two principal economies in the world. One was China, the other was India. I mean, when you looked at William Dalrymple's book, The Anarchy, it clearly mentioned there were only two major economies, almost 25% of the global economy.
India had 40% of the world GDP, close to 40% in 1600?
Yes, more or less. I'm not sure of the figures, but there were only two principal economies, India and China. So China definitely wants to assert its place. But China is also very cautious. Even when it was not this communist regime, even the Middle Kingdom was a very cautious regime when it came to dealing with the external borders and with the powers outside. So I don't expect, whereas some Indian sources fear and they're saying that they cannot rule out a larger conflict, border conflict, or a limited war between India and China, I think that China will continue to assert, and India will also not take any opportunity to create a war. But this situation, there's not going to be a war. I would say that the possibility of war is very limited, but China will continue to press on to India till India realizes that it has to live with China, and it has several benefits in terms of growing trade, a relationship, maybe becoming part of the new Silk Roads, CPEC project and all that. And its future lies with China, not with the United States and with the West. I think this is that sort of communication.
We thank you so much for giving us time today and giving us your insights. For our viewers, I'd like to thank you. To leave your feedback and comments below. Give us ideas of what other topics you'd like us to cover. And I look forward to speaking to you and seeing you soon.
Thank you.